I'm Zachary Formwalt, the artist in this exhibition, along with Jackson Hong. And yeah, I'm going to try to walk you through a bit the exhibition, although I have to admit that as I was kind of thinking this through this morning, and trying to imagine how to do that in 7 to 10 minutes, I realized that maybe I might not actually be the best person really to do that. So I will try. I will try to be concise, but that's one of the things I often struggle with, which is maybe part of my whole process of working, or the way I work the way I do, which is very can be very obsessive, I guess, in terms of details, and I often need really like a very small detail to research to be able to get some kind of understanding of any sort of bigger picture, and I think that's something that for me just feels like the way things are somehow, and it feels like the way it feels like a characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, to use a real classic Marxist term, which I like to use. So anyway, I will try to, maybe I'll have a couple of anecdotes here and there. I think that's maybe the most helpful. The more sort of worked out theoretical notions, I think, come through in most of the pieces, at least in the form that I ended up discovering for myself while working on them. This film is really quite a large collection of details that have to do first and foremost with the Hoogkaterijnen shopping center or urban development project, you might call it. It was a project in Utrecht in the Netherlands that began in the 1960s and which just finished kind of a new phase of renovation last year. So I made it in like the final year of this most recent renovation. Part of the program for that renovation was to bring back a lot of things that had been lost in the initial development. But anyway, as I was just standing here a moment ago and part of the beginning sequence came through, this idea about details and obsessiveness, and that tending for me to kind of ultimately sometimes lead to a dead end and sometimes lead to some kind of insight or something that I find out or figure out. I had forgotten about this way that the film starts, which is that it starts in reverse, but you can't tell that until it starts with a tracking shot of a model, or at least this one scene does. It's going across, and of course you can't tell whether it's in reverse or going forward, and we assume that it's going forward because for all intents and purposes it is, but suddenly in the background you start to see that there are people moving, and once they enter the frame then you realize it's in reverse because they are walking backwards. And it's a very small kind of formal detail that was not staged or anything. It came out like most of the details that involve peripheral figures in the various shots. It's just what is sometimes referred to as a happy accident or something, but for me it was also kind of a way maybe to suggest there's a lot of the construction of the images that I make have some detail that is undermining, let's say, what the voiceover is maybe delivering, or what the type of shot is supposed to be. There's some small thing that kind of makes it fall apart. or that contradicts that, or that sort of, seems paradoxical within it. And this kind of fragmentation of the otherwise seemingly straightforward shot is something that you'll find in a number of these works if you look for it at certain moments. And for me, that's part of, I think that's a very conscious effort that I have to kind of make those constructions. And I feel like those kind of constructions we encounter all the time. And it sort of points to, for me, the inherently contradictory nature of existence under conditions of contemporary capitalism, which is loaded with contradictions. Although we are constantly being presented with images that seem to suggest a kind of contradiction-free or a sort of, a sort of reality that we actually don't inhabit. Present works that come from a project they present works that were both filmed on the same site, but at different moments. So this work, Unsupported Transit, was shot in 2011, and the work in the following room, In Light of the Arc, is a two-screen installation, and that was made in 2013. So there's 2 years between them, and what the site is the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in Shenzhen. Even by 2013, the construction was not entirely finished. So that one is split between footage that was shot in the same shoot as this, Unsupported Transit, 2011. So when real construction was still underway, and it is cut with what is coming from 2013, which is inside once the exterior was finished, and details like the carpeting and seating and wall finishes and whatnot were being installed. Yeah, where to begin with these? They actually kind of begin with the film that is in the very last space, which is called In Place of Capital. But I don't want to talk too much about that yet, but what is presented there is, the part that relates to here is that there are a series of photographs that were made in 1845 of the Royal Exchange in London. And in 1845, photography was still really early on in its development. And so it was not, snapshots basically were not possible yet. So all exposures were long exposures. And what this meant was that any kind of even moderately paced movement would completely disappear, or nearly completely disappear. So in Unsupported Transit, this film was made like a time-lapse film, basically. Some sequences were shot at 3 frames per second. Some were shot at up to 7 frames per second, with longer exposures than you can achieve with a normal frame rate of 25 or 24, whatever, frames per second. So when you have these longer exposures, you get this effect of movement disappearing within it. But here it doesn't completely disappear, so there still remain certain traces. So what in a way gets presented is this process of disappearance. So you see the trace there, but you don't see the cause of the trace. You just get the trace before it fades away. And this is a kind of liminal position, like an in-between position between early, very long exposure and later snapshot photography, which allows eventually for the cinema. But basically, there are a series of historical narratives that kind of intersect around Marx's notion of the abbreviated form of capital which is the form that capital takes on the stock exchange, which of course is what this building is a stock exchange, or it will be. But at this moment, it's a site of production. And this site of production of the building itself will eventually disappear, and it will become a house for the abbreviated form of capital to take place.
The market will open.
The stock exchange is really an exemplary site where the relations of production and other social relations really disappear. If it's where the history of the movement of capital takes place, but also is being destroyed as it is taking place. Well, that was what I was gonna start with, and I was gonna point to these images here as being an example of the stock exchange, but actually these images are not of a stock exchange. They are of the Royal Exchange in London, which ironically enough has become a luxury shopping center. But this is the site I referred to earlier of those photographs from Henry Talbot from 1845, where these slower speeds, slower exposure speeds, the slower film and optics meant that it was impossible to actually capture an image of both the exchange and the people who were circulating around it at the time, all the activity that was going on. So you just had this image of the architecture itself. These images relate to the film that is behind this wall here, which is also, which I mentioned earlier, In Place of Capital. And behind me over there is the newest work, the most recent work in the exhibition from this year, 2021, a photo series. And behind that wall, on that side, is a film from last year called Wages on Sand. And this is a very different kind of site that is photographed and filmed there, but it's also a site where the history of the movement of capital disappears. But it's a different kind of disappearance, I would say. But this is going way back over here to the 17th and 18th centuries, so 1600s and 1700s. The site is the Keizersgracht in Amsterdam, and it belonged at one point to a family. Well, it still in a way belongs to them, but it's complicated. But in any case, the last owners were a very wealthy family that were involved in the founding of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The owners of the house and the history of the renovations that have taken place there, in particular this banister that forms the centerpiece of both the photographs and the film, it can't be attributed really to a single family. But all of the families that have inhabited it, or the ones who made significant changes to the architecture itself, the interior architecture in most cases, were wealthy families that were invested, well, in the stock exchange. The history of that family is very tied up with the founding of the VOC, which is also
but in exchange for this
going to the origins of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which is related very much to the origins of contemporary capitalism and in particular financial parts of that system. So what is it that's disappearing then in this house? Like what part of the capitalist system? Well, in the 17th and 18th centuries, as we know, there were all kinds of brutalities that were underlying this massive development of that was tied to the stock exchange, and with the Dutch East India Company in particular. Various forms of coerced labor, slavery, all of these these brutal colonial takeovers. These were all underlying the expansion of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It's this banister that the film follows, kind of from beginning to end, with a couple of interruptions. And this banister is the site of various different forms of obfuscation, but the most obvious one is the one that happens when the von Loon family moves in the 19th century, late 19th century, and they decide to change the ornamentation on the banister, to add in some extra details to fill in the gaps. And that original design carried the names of the two families, the two persons, their last names, their surnames, who lived there at the time and commissioned the change. And this is in the 18th century, so the 1700s, that change occurred. And one of the woman in the house at that time, she was of the Tripp family, a family in the Netherlands that is mostly associated with the arms trade, because they really expanded and developed the trade in weapons, the 17th century. Their name is forever associated with that, in part because they have this large house of their own elsewhere in Amsterdam, with these large cannons on it, and it was very much a part of their identity. So this name adorned the banister until the 19th century, when the von Loons moved in, and they added these parts so that the names were kind of hidden within the banister. This change that they made, which effectively anonymized the banister, made it into just a kind of generic ornamental motif instead of a motif that bore names, specific names, kind of parallels and repeats in a very different form all of these other forms of anonymization, much more brutal, linked to the actual production that all this wealth that was used to carry out these renovations was based upon. So this kind of very specific erasure of a name in the metropole, which corresponds in a quite convoluted, but also in a very direct way, if you think about it formally, to all of the brutal exploitation and expropriation that was going on in the colonies, and which was being transformed into the money that would be invested in the exchange back home in the metropole. So this is a quite different site for the wealthy home and its ornamentation, its artworks, its commissioned pieces. But it's also a site, just as the stock exchange, the commodities exchange, is for the erasure of the history that the movement of capital continually carries out in order to continue accumulating.